Good morning. I think we'll get started as people dribble in. I'm Catherine Rafelson. I'm the president of SID Washington, and delighted to have you at our morning breakout panel. This panel is on globalization, and very timely topic, of course, and looking at it from a number of different angles. And I'm really pleased that we have Stefano Prato here to moderate. Stefano is my counterpart, for those who didn't hear this morning, my counterpart at the Society for International Development. We are the Washington chapter of him. And he is based in Rome, and really grateful that he has come from Rome to lead this panel today. So thank you. And I'm just thrilled with our speakers. We have Ambassador Dos Santos, the ambassador to the U.S. from Mozambique. And then we have Rogerio Studart and Todd Tucker. And everybody's bios are in the conference app, which I know you have all downloaded. And so you can read all the details there. I don't want to take time away from the panel because we don't have that much time in a very full day. So thank you all so much. And I'm going to leave it to you now, Stefano. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Hope you can hear me fine. It's always a pleasure to be in Washington, and particularly at the Washington chapter event, considering also that this is the place in which our society was actually founded 61 years ago. And it's always a pleasure to hear of the Andrew Rice Award, having had the honor and the pleasure of working with him and getting inspired by him on the role that our society has played over the years and hopefully will continue to play in the years to come. Very much needed in today's circumstances. So let me explain how we're going to run this session with the facilitation and thought leadership of our speakers here, but also hopefully with active participation on your side. The SID's concerns with globalization, and in particularly the relationship between globalization and development, have actually sort of roots quite a few years ago. One of the SID's World Conferences in 1997, actually in a moment in which I can tell you not a lot of people were talking about globalization, was actually titled "Which Globalization?" Trying to move beyond the debate on the pros and cons on the globalization and asking the question on how globalization could be shaped in the perspective of the imperatives of people-centered sustainable development. So it's interesting how to reflect on what has happened over these couple of decades from that moment. So today's session, of course, confined within 1 hour, and therefore with the limitation of what we can do within 1 hour, we'll try to address 4 questions. The first question is the relationship between globalization and inequalities. Many actually highlight the fact that the current pattern of economic globalization, economic globalization is one of the many dimensions of globalization, has actually contributed to skyrocketing inequalities that we've seen in the last years. And in many ways, we've reached a point where the structure of inequalities has generated a structural gap of demand, which is actually constraining our capacity to restart also fully our economies after the crisis. But paradoxically, this is also combined with an excess of liquidity. Two things which normally in conventional economic theory don't go easily hand in hand together. So the first question is really about globalization and inequalities. The second question looks at a very interconnected issue, which is the relation between globalization and financialization. And this is particularly important because it's actually finance that has been, in some respect, even more than trade, the architect and the driver of the current pattern of globalization. And we meet this year in which we risk to celebrate the 10 years anniversary of the last crisis, potentially with another crisis, which may not necessarily be a fantastic way to celebrate it. So, second question, globalization and financialization. The third question is about globalization and what I can call dematerialization. What would that be? You know, you can claim that even more than finance today, information, digitalization is actually taking over, even from finance, the lead energy, the lead driving force against a certain part of economic globalization. This is coming with increasing delocalization, increasing work automation, and a number of challenges for those people which are confined in the real world with their challenges, their daily challenges actually found, rather than in that virtual delocalized space. So how do we see the relation evolving between globalization and digitalization? Can the two be decoupled in pace? And lastly, the issue of governance, because I guess the way in which we address this issue ultimately means raising the question of if we can somehow reshape these drivers to reorient globalization from the perspective of where us as development community we are most primarily concerned with. So inequalities, financialization, dematerialization, digitalization as you call it, and governance, and in particularly economic governance. I'm going to ask the three speakers we have here to give us some snapshots on each of these questions. And in each of these questions, I'm going to ask one or two interventions or questions from the floor. So that rather than squeezing your participation to the end, we actually try to have, in the limits of the numbers, an interactive discussion. Okay? So that's how we go, and I guess no more interaction from my side, and maybe I will ask Ambassador Dos Santos to give us the first kickoff on the relationship between globalization and inequalities.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Thank you very much, Society for International Development, for not only organizing this event, but having us here. The participation of an African ambassador cannot be taken for granted in this process. And if we're talking about globalization, we're talking about inclusion. Every one of us have to be there. And we appreciate that. Thank you very much. I think there's general consensus that globalization cannot be stopped because it doesn't recognize boundaries. The processes, even if we try, will not stop. So I've been reading a lot as a student of international relations. Scholars have said that, but sometimes we don't seem to listen, have said when you try to promote localization, you're actually going to heed to globalization because the processes do not recognize boundaries. If we agree on that, then we'll agree that whatever happens in the United States will happen in Mozambique, will happen in Italy, will happen elsewhere. And there is a differentiation there. So without going into the theories behind these, I thought of speaking with an African perspective because Africa has been seen as the marginalized continent. And my point is, I don't think Africa will continue to be marginalized. Why? Precisely because globalization, with all of its negative impacts on the continent, has also allowed the continent to shortcut progress. Actually, there is a shortcut to progress. Why am I saying this? Well, just look at what we have with mobile money. It originated from Kenya and adapted in Mozambique as M-Cash. That is an achievement of knowledge economy, and knowledge does not recognize boundaries. Now, if internet platforms can offer that possibility, all other technologies can also offer that possibility, because knowledge economy does not recognize boundaries. Now imagine the continent of Africa availing itself of the opportunity of knowledge economy, service economy, together with abundant resources that it has to develop the continent. Now, you can say, well, but those possibilities have existed in the past, but Africa has not developed. And I'm saying we have an evolution within the continent. We are going to speak about governance later on, but we are looking at processes that allow the continent to move forward. One is the African Union with its Agenda 2063. Some people say, well, that's just a vision, but it is actually happening. Things are happening. Political will is present today. That is why you have 44 countries signing on trade-free zone. That is a very important development. And Donald Kaberuka was speaking to African ambassadors on Africa Day only last week. And he said something that I agree very much with, that this is not just for trade barriers. This is not just trade per se. This is a game changer. This is a paradigm shift in the mindset of Africans, because they want to do what is necessary to generate rapid growth. They want to do away with boundaries within Africa without infringing on sovereignty. Sovereignty is still there, but they want to do away with those boundaries. Now imagine a powerful African continent. You cannot marginalize Africa. Well, it's not just because of that. It's also because of the role of Africa in international affairs. You cannot have lasting peace and security in the world if you don't have peace and security in Africa. And Africa is no longer only the passive participant in this. Is in the decision-making processes that are there. Now, it's about how do we improve decision-making systems in international arena, in the all the other universal and global institutions, to make sure that the contributions of Africa are benefiting the whole globe. Yes, Wakanda can contribute to the world. And I think that's where we're heading. That's what I could say.
Thank you, Ambassador. Rogerio, your turn.
Thank you. How long do we have?
I would ask if we can keep it around 3-4 minutes so
Okay,
that
wow,
we
that's going to be
keep
fast.
going and get some intervention from the floor.
Let me then start by thanking for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here talking to you. And let me start by, first of all, I agree entirely with you that it's good to have inclusion in the development space. I wish, and I see that as a lot of inclusion in the plenary. I wish we had more here for the next time, just particularly gender inclusion would be interesting. Now, but let me disagree just one point with you to start there. Globalization cannot be stopped. History tells us that it can be stopped. And the last time it stopped was being between the two wars. And it was stopped by a huge financial crisis that led to the consequence that we know in terms of in the conflicts that it generated. And it ended tragically. So we have to be very careful to understand that it's globalization is whatever the world leadership can make out of that and civil society can make out of that in the future. We are in a very dangerous path at the moment. Now, let me, you asked to talk about inequality, and let me look at history again to get some globalization and inequality, to take some lessons. I was reading Martin Wolf, who's always good to read, of course, and he repeats something that you hear a lot. I was at the World Bank for many, many years and in the development space for many years, which is right. I mean, globalization in the past 30 years, increase of trade was extremely beneficial for the world. It reduced poverty wherever it could integrate, particularly emerging markets. If you look at the G2, the United States and China, both, for just to take a sample, China had an enormous reduction of poverty, and the United States benefited a lot by increasing consumption, even though with the stagnations of wages. Now, globalization has two parts, trade and finance. The lesson of history is that when finance expands very rapidly, it can be beneficial for globalists for trade, but if it runs too fast, it can lead to financial crisis and collapse that we've seen in many cases. And one of the reasons why after the war, the Bretton Woods system was created was exactly to have a little bit more control of finance, make it more productive for reconstruction and then development, and allow for trade to grow together. If you look at the data, I had some graphs I want to share with you, but you can find that anywhere. Any index of trade and financial globalization, you're going to see trade going very fast since the 1970s, particularly in the 80s, and financial globalization going like this. This gap was very good for trade because it allowed, for instance, in the United States with the financial deregulation and the regulation of the international financial sector to have a paradox here, which is stagnant wages at the same time, a very rapid increase in credit, which allowed the United States to become, and I'm going to be to try to be short about that, the consumer of last resort, whereas in China it became, and other countries, I'm just using the G2 to make the case, the producer of last resort. China was growing by employing more people. The United States was growing by maintaining wages stagnant, but at the same time increasing credit substantially, increasing debt. That led to a situation where you have inequality rising, reducing among countries, but rising in countries. Yeah. This is the tragedy of this period, which created another structure imbalance, which was the imbalance of trade. If you look at the deficit in the United States and the surplus in China, they mirror each other. They go like this. Now, those imbalances create fragility. Fragility can become instability if it's triggered. And when finance is going that fast, it's quite sure that at some point that financial fragility is going to become a crisis. So you have a situation, after of course, we ended in the crisis in 2008, 2009, and initially the solution for that was one of coordinated policies, fiscal policies, so on. But the solution that we had was exactly, it exacerbated the trends that you had in the past. As you know, the United States started the quantitative easing, which was followed by Europe, which expanded liquidity in the financial markets, creating booms everywhere in the housing market now. And of course, the economies recovered. But if you look at financial globalization vis-a-vis trade, the gap is even wider. So we are in a very fragile situation. Now, just to conclude with the last question that you asked, what is the future? The future is whatever we make out of that. I mean, if you look at the lessons of the past, it's quite clear that finance is powerful. It can be a powerful way of overcoming crises, leveraging growth, and producing transformation. And we need transformations. We need transformations in the way we produce, the way we consume, the way we transport. Otherwise, we don't have a plan B for this planet, as far as I know. So we need transformation. There's an opportunity that finance, if guided, can deliver that transformation. But we have to be careful that finance, the changes in finance are not going to lead to the financial stability that we had in the past. Unfortunately, this is what is happening. Today, there's another discussion about financial deregulation in the United States. This, for me, raises the flag. More than the rhetoric that we have about trade and so on, that can, I think, is going to be resolved by common sense, I would say. But the flag that is risen to me is the issue of financial deregulation and the incapacity that leadership have had in the past 10 years of the crisis to build the architecture in the international financial sector to deliver the transformations that we need, the transformation that we need to recalibrate globalization, to produce the transformations in the way we produce transport and so on to avoid climate change. That is what is really concerned. And the only way that we can avoid that is by addressing these issues in a straightforward. And it can, Ambassador, unfortunately, if we don't do that, it can be interrupted, and it can be dramatic again.
Many thanks, Rogerio. Todd.
All right, thanks so much to Stefano and to the organizers and all of you for being here. It's a great privilege and an honor. I'm going to focus my comments a little bit more on developed countries, in part because the politics have changed here so much in recent years with big implications for development policy, but also developed countries confronting a lot of the kinds of instabilities that we often associate with other parts of the planet. So, the question is on sort of, and I like the way you framed it, of kind of what are the different modes of globalization. It's neither good nor bad. And I think one of the ways that distinguishes how globalization plays out on a national level is really going to be about domestic institutions. So the same process of globalization can look and feel very differently depending on what kinds of institutions you have at home. I would sort of point to two institutions in particular. One, sort of a changing role of the state, and two, sort of a changing role of labor market institutions. And these both, I would say, impact quite heavily on inequality. So to take sort of, two snapshots of the role of the state. In 1919, the U.S. military decided to, sort of as a show of might and as a show of national power, do the first coast-to-coast motorcade of the military. And they went from the East Coast to the West Coast. Dwight Eisenhower was on that motorcade as a young soldier. It took 62 days. They were going about an average of 5 miles an hour. It did not take a genius to realize that there'd be some benefits to stronger infrastructure. And in one of the lessons that Eisenhower gained from being in the theater during World War II is that the Autobahn in Germany actually made things go quite a bit faster. So one of his first acts in office was to sign the Interstate Highway Act, which took 3 decades to be fully implemented, a cost of about $500 billion. What does that show about the state? I mean, it shows sort of a unique ability to think in a very long-term horizon and make capital investments that it's difficult to get the private sector to make on their own. That's a snapshot of sort of the role of the state as it used to be. Fast forward to today, the role of the state during the Trump administration. We see a lot less long-term thinking. To take one example that's relevant to this room, the steel tariffs that Trump has sort of floated and withdrawn, and then floated and withdrawn. One could imagine, setting aside the merits of developing a steel industry in the U.S., but one could imagine a long-term industrial policy that would actually make sense. But a lot of a good role for state policy would be one that would have more predictability, where sort of the objectives in terms of labor market and human capital would be laid out in advance, and then it would take decades to actually get there. But I think sort of by using the trade lever, it's an attempt to sort of do that quickly and on the cheap. And so these are kind of that's one instance of how globalization has changed the role of the state. To switch to sort of labor market institutions, again, sort of to take two snapshots. In the early part of the 20th century, a lot of the open market economies, generally more open, small economies of Europe, Scandinavia, took the step of building labor market institutions that would be sustainable, that would be nationwide, that would ensure strong collective bargaining rights. They didn't do that necessarily out of some sort of socialist feel-good sentiment. Really, they realized that it was an important tool of competition to be able for firms to be able to restrain wage growth and to control how and when strikes happened. And that was a way to sort of keep afloat in the global economy, paradoxically, in today's discourse, by strengthening rather than weakening labor market institutions. Fast forward to today, over the last few decades, we've seen sort of a change in the way that especially international institutions think about these labor rights and these labor institutions. So in the 1950s, around the same time Eisenhower was signing the Interstate Highway Act, we had also the European Convention of Human Rights signed in Europe that instituted sort of a right to collective bargaining and a right to be a membership in a union. That was sort of unprecedented for the time for an international treaty, very impressive accomplishment. How that's been interpreted in the last few decades by the European Court of Human Rights is kind of the opposite, the right to not belong in a union, which has been one of the factors over a series of decisions in the last few decades that has led to even the Scandinavian countries that had 80 or 90% unionization rates beginning to dismantle those institutions. So again, sort of that's one of the main drivers of inequality is sort of a weakening of labor market institutions. So that changing role of the state, changing role of labor market institutions, I think, do a lot of work to explaining this rise in inequality that we've seen.
Thank you so much, Todd, and thanks also for the previous intervention. So let's see if there is one or two interventions or questions at this point within the audience. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much to SID for this excellent panel. I come from Humana People to People Planet Aid. We represent development organizations on the ground, specifically in Africa. And thanks for inviting the ambassador. That's a great honor for Africa. I wanted to ask specifically to the ambassador of Mozambique, how in the light of globalization, how can we as development professionals gathered here at the conference, but also institutions as a whole, better work with the governments and people of Africa to make sure that the positive effects of globalization can optimally benefit the people?
Thank you so much. Any other question or intervention at this point? Yes, please go ahead.
I don't want to drag you too much into a political debate, but are you concerned about, say, the U.S. policies that seem to be moving towards more trade protectionism? How do you think that's going to play out in the international circles? That's obviously sort of a big elephant in the room.
Please, last, and then we continue.
So any comments on some of the political aspects of globalization? To give an example, let's say proliferation and increasing power of supranational entities seems to have caused a lot of backlash, and have people considered alternatives, things like this?
Okay, thank you. So I think, you see, this is going to be a process of increasing complexity, because the speakers will have dual challenges. You know, the questions that we've set and then the questions that we add. And I will ask them to combine them creatively. But the second round, I think, again, combined with what has been asked from the floor, is really to explore. In many of your interventions, you pointed out that certain drivers that have characterized globalization and to some extent have contributed to increasing inequalities. And many of them also relate to finance. And one can say that in the global division of labor and in the global division of returns from economic activities, we moved away from the traditional wage versus physical capital, you know, relation where we started, and increasingly the lion's share of returns have been moving away from that nexus towards financial capital and increasingly information. So how can we think about a globalization that is decoupled from financialization? not only because of the financial instability that is inherent within it, and I think we experience every day, particularly in a moment in which we have a new debt crisis, which is really mounting every day, but also because of the structure of inequalities it generates and the incapacity in a way to even address pre-existing inequalities, let alone establishing new ones. And in this context, let me also remind us that one of the most pervasive structural inequalities in the global economy remains those of gender inequalities, which are very well presented here in the panel, as you can see. But because the women's contribution, particularly the whole dimension of care work and unpaid care work, represents and continues to represent the largest subsidy to the global economy. And in times of financial crisis, has been actually the greatest counter-cyclical element of support to the social economy that we've experienced. So financialization generates a number of challenges of development nature at various levels. Can we imagine it to be decoupled? Rogerio, you may want to go first on this.
Perhaps the ambassador wants to start because there was a question for him. Yeah.
It's fine.
Okay, I can.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I took too much time. I realized that. I'll try to be short this time. I apologize for that. Listen, again, let's look at history. I mean, the lesson from history in the after the war was that you have to find ways to put sand in financial globalization, controlling capital flows, and trying to discipline domestic financial markets so that they can be as functional to reconstructions, to development, to transformation as possible. And it happened. It happened. It's not something that, we're not reinventing the wheel or history. It can be done. So I think that the way to do about it is to look at what is happening in financial deregulation nowadays and say, listen, that's not what we want. We want a financial market that is more pro-growth, pro-poor, that reduces inequality, that boosts trades, that does more trade for Africa, for Latin Americans, and so on and so on. That's the way to go about it. And I think we are missing, I mean, there's a gentleman said, that the big elephant in the room is trade. It's not trade. I mean, let me give you just an anecdote. Recently, the economic czar of China had a conversation with Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin, and talking about the tariffs that the United States wanted to impose on China. And Mnuchin, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce his name. He cannot pronounce my name, so it's not a big deal. So, but the truth, I was reading the first thing that, we can discuss several issues. For instance, the first one, and he mentions that opening up the financial market of China to international investors. This is what the discussion is, the most silent discussion in the room. It's the elephant that doesn't make any noise, moving and repeating itself. There was a discussion now about further deregulation beyond the dismantling of Dodd-Frank in the United States. And between the tweets and Roseanne Barr, nobody's talking about that. And this is the big elephant in the room. If we want to avoid, we have to understand that a disciplined financial sector, domestically, internationally, can be extremely good to put in order financing of trade, finance of growth, finance of transformation. If we don't act on that, we're going to repeat history.
Thank you so much, Rogerio. So maybe I'll ask Todd to go first, and then I'll leave you the last word, and also with the question that was asked you. Todd.
Sure. So as to the question about how worried should we be about sort of Trump's trade policies, I've been fairly bearish on these policies, in part because as a political scientist, I look at the system that was built up that made the trade agreements and sort of the trade infrastructure possible in the first place, which was a lot by sort of mobilizing constituencies that would want to support open trade. So, for instance, you have a lot of an interest on K Street that have an interest. You have sort of checks and balances between the branches of government where sort of the interest of farm states can be well represented. So I think that you've seen, in the day-to-day tweets, you've seen a lot of noise, but not a lot of follow-through. And in part, that's because the system is working. Now, that doesn't make for easy sleeping. That doesn't make for lack of sweat and nervousness on a day-to-day basis. But I think that on the fundamentals, the system is basically delivering that. Now, that's what I've said up until now. Tomorrow could be a different story. We may have sort of steel tariffs going up on Europe. In Japan, they're certainly very concerned about that. But I think at the same time, there are sort of those interests in Congress, those interests in industry that have been fairly successful at beating back the most aggressive moves that Trump has threatened. And I think that, but I think it is a good point. Sort of what is kind of driving this backlash to a certain type of globalization, and I think that this kind of gets back again to sort of different ways of thinking about sort of the globalization and finance nexus. These are design choices. We don't have to do it all the same way. And to sort of take one example from my own research, from the just published Judge Not book, available in fine bookstores near you, at least Kramer books. This was a case study primarily of investor-state dispute settlement, which is one of the more kind of controversial aspects of globalization in recent years, where multinational companies can sue their host states over foreign direct investment gone wrong. One of the oddities of this system is that, first of all, it's been very active. So sort of, in the same time that the World Trade Organization has, gone through about a few hundred cases, we now have about 900 cases, mostly since the year 2000 in the system. So it's become one of the a very active space for rule writing in the global economy. And it would sort of seem on paper, and actually the companies have demanded about $500 billion, which happens to be nicely for my comments, the exact amount that it costs to make the interstate highway over 3 decades. A nice little case of symmetry there. So it's become very active, but one of the oddities of the system is that although on paper it would seem to be quite favorable to companies because they can sue states but not vice versa, in practice, states have done quite well, winning a lot more cases than they've lost. Companies are getting pennies on the dollar of what they demand. So it would sort of seem that maybe not that big of a concern for sovereignty. So what explains sort of the cases? What explains why companies keep bringing these cases? And it turns out that the answer is finance. So once the company makes the decision to launch the case or not, whatever's happened with the host government has already happened. In a sense, it's kind of a sunk cost. So the decision really at that point is whether to hire a lawyer or not. It turns out that lawyers and the litigation finance industry has built up on the sides of the ISDS system. So hedge funds are sort of funding the legal cost in exchange for a share of whatever award comes on the back end. So this is kind of a securitization of the law in a sense. And this is why, even though it's not good for companies, not particularly good for host countries that are seeking to attract FDI, these cases continue to be brought. And I think that is a design choice. You don't have to have a system that's sort of fueled by speculation. You could have one where the remedies are different, and you could actually be addressing these kind of conflicts on the front end, so that before sort of the relationships between the host states and the investors have gone south, you have mediation, you have other mechanisms to try to come to a better solution.
Thank you, Todd.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for those questions. The first one on how to work to help governments that in need of assistance, like in Africa and Mozambique in particular. I would say listen to the people of the country in the first instance. Listen to their governments, listen to their civil society, listen to their academics, because they know the situation work with them to develop strategies, look at the strategies they have, bring your knowledge from where you're working elsewhere in the world. That experience is usually very useful for governments to take into account. Your own organization, I happen to know what you do. It's excellent. It's investing in capacity building, and I think that's what our countries need most. And as non-governmental organizations, you are able to fill in the gaps of capacity in all spheres of life. And I think Mozambique has benefited a lot from the contribution of non-governmental organizations over the years. And we have learned to work with those organizations in different parts and have a constructive dialogue and resolve the tensions of the past, because there was this feeling that we, the NGOs, know it all. And there was the feeling from the government that, no, we know our country best. So we have gone over that, and we are now working to really build partnerships in that sense. On the topic of financing and linking to the first one, I think both international relation theorists and economists, international political scholars, grappling with the fact that globalization is changing perceptions, is changing even the way we think things should go. So I always try to find some clarity when I read many people, but I like some of Joseph Stiglitz's comments around these and what he has written in his book on globalization. He worked for the US government. He is a scholar, and he worked for the World Bank. So I think he has a great wealth of experience. And one of the things that he says is the role of government. And here I agree with you, Todd. Governments have to mitigate market failures and to ensure social justice. Because if we leave it to the market, the invisible hand will not really solve issues of inequality, of differences. But it also, he also speaks of the mindset that needs to change. How do we relate to these inequalities? And also, how do we deal with the financial sector? And again, here, I agree with Rogerio about deregulation or just leaving it to the markets to resolve financial issues. Because, again, financial markets can go in completely different directions and not the direction that we want to go. We do have a financial architecture in place under the Bretton Woods institutions and other regional development banks, other international financial institutions. How perfect are they? They are not perfect. Is the reform that is going on in these institutions going in the right direction? I think so, but not enough. They are not democratic enough. I just give you one example. The World Bank and the IMF have, for each developed country, one executive director there. And for Africa and Latin America, 22. You have one executive director for 23 countries. How democratic is that? I know we are not contributing enough money or special drawing rights to the IMF, but we have to listen more to the voices of the majority of countries that are being affected. And I think this is one of the points that Joseph Stiglitz puts there. I think Sachs also addresses those problems, and I think we have to listen more to our scholars in this country, but also in Africa and Latin America. We have great recommendations on how to move forward. What has been the problem is that we tend to defend self-interests of the country, and forgetting that the self-interest of the country can only be defended well if we take care of the interests of other countries. I think this is how we should try and manage globalization, how we reshape institutions, how we reshape decision-making processes, how we ensure inclusion of all kinds.
Thanks, Ambassador, also because you made my task very simple as I was launching in the last round precisely on the governance question. But before we do that, I want to hear if there are comments or questions that may come from the floor. Please.
I just want to add,
Microphone.
I mean, this lovely conversation, lovely commentary, and really appreciated. The lady from Humana asked this question about working with local governments. And being an international organization working in India, I think it's very, very important. I mean, there's got a lot of moving parts. One part which I want to emphasize here is building local partnerships. So if you have a local NGO or local entity and build a partnership with them, sign an MOU which is with clear expectations, you have a better chance of success because they understand the ground realities better than you do, sitting from here. So they could be your buffer and channel. So because you have more leverage with them than you have with the government, because the government will keep changing. The people managing the government will keep changing. So that's just some from experience in life. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Let me see if there are other hands also as well, so I get a sense on. Okay, go ahead.
So just one comment about globalization, but away from the macro level. And it's also a question, so do you think that globalization is somehow biased or selective? Because the ambassador started his first comment talking about cash money and mobile money and how we're shifting from the old to the new. These technological tools. And we see, for example, in countries, even in rural areas, in remote areas, everyone has a cell phone, but they don't have, for example, a toilet. So how do you interpret this in this context of globalization, where some things can spread out very quickly and others don't, even though we're investing a lot and we're doing a lot of efforts to make this happen, and it impacts health and development. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erin Ending with Palladium. Actually, my question links to the one that was just asked, and the last word of the ambassador, I think, might have been inclusion. So I want to talk and get your thoughts, particularly about kind of the linkages between globalization, geography, and inclusion. And in particular, I feel like the phenomenon of globalization can reach the relatively reachable populations within countries. In port cities and in major cities, it's harder to reach in a positive way those that are not in those locations. And then, of course, you've got the issue of landlocked or land-linked countries and small Pacific Island nations. How can we reach the very difficult to reach populations?
Thanks, Erin.
Yeah, just
Melissa,
one
and
question.
then Morgan.
Thanks, Stefano. So you were talking a lot about FDI, also talking about the important role that local governments play in financing. And at the chat next door, Steve Radlett took a quiz of the audience to ask who thought which was the highest contribution of financing in development, and there was technical assistance, remittances, FDI, philanthropy, and local government financing. And the response is by orders of magnitude, it's local government financing. Yeah. So the question would be, just to build on the first question that was asked to you, how do we unlock that? How do we really use that to achieve our shared goals of equitable development across the country and the globe?
Thanks, Melissa. Morgan, as the last.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. Just a quick question. You were talking about pro-growth and pro-poor policies, and how we can't rely on the invisible hand to maintain things like Dodd-Frank and Bretton Woods. And labor is so far decoupled from capital and from government. Now, what kind of mechanisms can we rely on to uphold some of those regulatory mechanisms and really strengthen policy to actually promote those kind of things you were talking about? Thanks.
Thanks. And I think I'm going to kind of build on what we heard here to kick on our last round. It's clear that we have a governance question, as was framed by some of the interventions as well as by the ambassador. And the governance question has many levels. One level is the issue of the need for democratizing global governance in what is currently still very much a sort of a Bretton Woods institution sort of framework. You know, many have talked about how much you can try and rebalance that with a greater UN-centeredness in a number of processes. There's a whole discussion about the importance of an inclusive UN-centered mechanism for tax cooperation that can, for instance, curb illicit financial flows, which are fundamentally letting Africa bleed most of its resources rather than use them for development, for instance. But similarly, as we talk about debts and the debt crisis, you know, the need for a maybe debt workout mechanism and others. So there is an issue with respect to the mechanisms of democratization of global governance. But there is also another form of democratization, as a couple of interventions has alluded to, which is how to bridge the local and the global, you know, which is a different level. Some people suggest that we need greater density of institutions. Some other people think that we need mechanism for greater participation of local communities, local authorities into that sort of global governance mechanism. But there's also a third issue, which is how to bridge the democratic deficits, which are implicitly part of governmental action. How to, in a context in which very often the space for civil society participation is actually shrinking for different dynamics, whether because people are increasingly scared of speaking out, or simply because the mechanism are actually increasingly closing down. So the issue of governance has many dimensions. I imagine you won't be able to address them all, but pick what you think is most important as a last round of contribution to this conversation. Who wants to go first? Todd?
Yeah.
Please.
So I'm going to sort of piece together a few of these interventions and as well the questions that you just posed. You know, I think it's an interesting contrast. You know, I mentioned sort of the power of institutions and who is the coalition that's going to defend the policies that are in place. It's been an interesting contrast watching the NAFTA renegotiations on the one hand and the Dodd-Frank repeal on the other hand. You know, the same sort of populist candidate wins an election, threatens to drain the swamp. On the one hand, he starts attempting to dismember NAFTA, and so far has been unsuccessful in his ability to do so, because there is such a strong coalition of export interest that will fight, like even sort of the most trivial or minor of changes. On the other hand, Dodd-Frank repeal happens, and who's there to fight for keeping it? No real organized interest. And in fact, I remember for sort of a pre-academic life, I worked at a consumer group on the day that Lehman Brothers went under. And we sort of looked around and I was like, who does finance around here? Does anyone do finance? And it turned out we had dismissed the person that did finance a decade before, because after the Gramm-Leach-Bliley bill, there was less day-to-day watchdogging that needed to be done, because the deregulation just kind of effectively took policymakers out of making a lot of the day-to-day decisions. So the nonprofit sector and the foundations were not investing in that capacity. So, and still, to be honest, I mean, you know, a decade later, there's still a sharp lack of capacity, I would say, in civil society around financial issues overall. So it seems to me that the process of institutional regeneration is a vital one, and I'm becoming increasingly convinced it's probably the most important thing that, at least speaking from a U.S. perspective, should be done after the next election. And one of the things I mean by that is, to connect to sort of an earlier point, the rebuilding of the labor institutions. I think that absolutely, that was a force in the past for pushing for financial regulation, defending it. I think it's really important that we see that. Looking at sort of their role in electoral processes, the minority turnout goes way up coming out to vote when Black and Latinos belong to a union relative to those that don't belong to a union. So it's just a key mechanism that's integrating the local labor market with the national policy-making space. And in the absence of that, in the void, you have, there is this democracy deficit. There is this sense of distance between people on the ground and national policymakers, international policymakers. And in the absence of institutions that can mobilize, educate, you have Fox News. You have sort of in the void. That's, and you have sort of the kinds of populism that we've been seeing in a variety of countries in the last few years, because at least they're talking about that gap and how distant people feel from their national governments. And I think that even in the Italian elections in the last few weeks, we've seen that, it's a complicated situation on the ground. There's a lot of things to consider. But the European Union didn't do any favors when they had a delegate go on television a few days ago and sort of say the financial markets will teach them how to vote right. That doesn't do anything to close the democracy deficit, and that widens it. So I think we need sort of a lot more humility on the part of international governance institutions to re-embed themselves in the communities they're supposed to serve. Because if that doesn't happen, you will eventually see more disintegration, more populism, more chaos. So I think it's really in everyone's interest to begin to close that deficit.
Thanks. Rogerio?
Thank you. I feel like a child in a candy store. There's so many things that you presented, so many interesting things. But I think what is interesting for you, and the question has been that, is what role you have as development players on the ground. And I want to emphasize that. Somebody said it's completely true that most of development happens locally, particularly it's financed locally. The problem is how you organize that finance, what kind of structure, what kind of governance, what kind of public institutions you developed, what kind of relation you have with the private sector. That makes your role extremely important, because you're not just an ambassador, you're a bridge. I've been working with Brookings on the issue of financing sustainable infrastructure. And I've been looking at how domestically successful cases from Germany to China, from Brazil to Indonesia, from the United States and so on, how they structure internally the governance and so on in order to scale up, and this is important, success cases in my case, in terms of sustainable infrastructure. Okay, I think this is the role that you could always have. It's bringing that kind of knowledge and understanding, as somebody else has said that the locals probably have extremely successful cases that can be scaled up for the simple reason that they know more of the problems and the solutions for the problems. What they need basically is find mechanisms to scale up using their own resources. External finance is a minuscule part of that role. So you can have much more significant impact by helping them in a humble way to develop that structures, that architecture, what I call architecture. Wow, I used 2 minutes, but I want to say something. Ambassador, I was the executive director of Brazil, and I like to say that I was executive director of Haiti, because I represented 8 countries in the World Bank from Haiti, and we only had 9. And I appreciate you saying that the governance problems are significant. At the time of the first election of a World Bank president ever, and I was the only one that publicly supported Ngozi, who is an incredible African leadership and of course a woman, and I think that that's something that people have stopped discussing. Those institutions have become irrelevant financially. but they still have a significant role to play in what I just have said. And the issue of inclusion and governance of those institutions is still have not been touched. Something that you can be a bridge out there to bring, the knowledge required to scale up projects and create the architecture, but you can also be the ambassadors here to make a case that those development institutions have got to become more democratic, more inclusive. They have to be able to address 21st century issues. Again, there are all these candies around, but I'll leave this for some other moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Ambassador.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, they were very important and varied questions. I'll try to respond in a general form to be short. I think we all agree that governance is important for all countries, and it should be important for global institutions as well. We all want good political, economic, and corporate governance. And if we have that at the national level, it should allow us to develop strategies that will deal with the problems of the nation, that have to deal with information technologies, with the toilets, with the sanitation. That's what you were referring to. Education, sanitation, water supply, all of those things have to be part of a development strategy, of development policy and program. If we have that, then we allow that everyone benefits, and the development will be balanced throughout our nations. That, taken to the global level, is using multilateralism, and I think here it's a question of mindset, knowing that global problems can only be solved through global solutions. And if we believe in that, then we'll make the institutions that are supposed to run these global problems and find solutions. Then we will not say we don't want these institutions, but we will work seriously to make them more effective, more efficient, more productive. And it is possible. And I think if we look at the UN many years ago, and I was ambassador to the UN for 6.5 years in the 90s, it works much, much better today than it used to work then. And I remember that time, we ambassadors at the UN were criticizing the Bretton Woods institutions because of the way they were dealing with development programs, structural adjustment programs, looking only at the economics of things, nothing social. The World Bank changed because at that time we had meetings between the Board of Governors of the IMF and the World Bank at the UN. We came from the UN over here and we discussed this. And then you started to have a change. And now the World Bank is a very important partner institution with governments like my own and other developing countries. And it's a matter of making the process more perfect or improve on it. And I think some work is being done. I've mentioned the fact that we need more democracy within these institutions and also improve their ways of doing things. And we also have attained a degree of consensus in terms of what needs to be done. That's why we had the MDGs. We didn't achieve all the goals, but we actually made some very good progress. So if we put more effort into the SDGs, I'm sure we can get there and we can manage to shape institutions to include all. And coming back to Africa, in terms of governance, if you look at Africa of 20 years ago and Africa of today, you will see that you have more democracies in Africa, imperfect as they are, but you have more democracies in Africa than you had 20 years ago. You don't have Africa, the African Union, accepting any coup d'etat. any rebel movement in any country in Africa wanting to have a coup d'etat will always find the problem of being marginalized or suspended from a regional organization, as is the case of Madagascar in SADC, or also at the level of the African Union, will not be accepted until such a time that democratic process is reinstated in that country. So that is an evolution. And when you look at all the other peace and security architecture, the structures that are being put in place, the reform that the African heads have agreed upon, really lends, I think, a new dynamic in Africa that will change. And the young people of Africa, the civil society organizations of Africa today are much, much more active, much more capable, and we can build on those capacities and I think move in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and I think that takes us, unfortunately, to the need to wrapping up our session here. These are very complex issues, and in many ways, the dynamics of globalization, particularly the systemic drivers of economic, monetary, trade systems, have been issues to which we as development communities very often we've been a little bit blind to over the years, because of our somehow urgent mission to focus on poverty and marginalization. And this has made us very often blind to some of the actual dynamics at play that actually generate poverty and marginalization in the first place, or continue to ensure that the structure that somehow intergenerationally transmit poverty and marginalization continue to be at play. So if we really want to advance in the new 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we can no longer, as development community, ignore these dynamics. And we need to find ways to interrogate them and to find actually a new advocacy agenda that enables us to shape and reshape globalization. Because we can do that. Because as it was pointed out by many, it is actually the result of clear decisions, clear institutions. There are dimensions of it which are somehow inevitable, our desire to be more closely interconnected, but not the particular forms that this is taking, in particularly economically. So the question for us is to shift from thinking about poverty and really thinking about inequalities. The moment we think about inequalities, and we do it not because we replace poverty with inequality in our narrative, but we really look at the relationship between prosperity and poverty, then this will take us to challenge and to have an agenda on how to address many of these issues. And possibly the starting point is how to bridge the governance questions along the various divides across countries, between the local and the global, and in terms of the democratic deficit, and how to bring in people more consistently and structurally into that process. We as SID will try and continue this conversation. We're opening a new sort of global round of research and policy discussions on globalization, as we did in the past. You may also be aware SID facilitates globally the Finance and Fund Development civil society movement. In particular, we are developing a number of initiatives on financial literacy for civil society organization, to understand financialization, to understand some of these economic dimensions, even if we deal with education, with health, because we are seeing increasingly that these dynamics are trickling down in all our sectors. So we need to understand them, because in order to, when we understand them, then we can also provide a response. And with these notes, I'd like to thank you all, and thank, of course, our speakers, and I think we can provide them with a good round of applause. And of course, invite you to continue with the full day program. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.